Eliza Orzeszkowa, The Argonauts. Every subscription brings me enormous joy and motivation. Chapter 19. What Marion had told Krenitsky about Darvid was true. The man was engaged in real orgies of labor. His assistants and associates were bending beneath it and losing breath. He seemed more untiring than ever. Councils, meetings, accounts, balances, correspondence, discussions with functionaries of the government, of finance and of industries, banks, bureaus, exchanges, auctions, etc. And in all this appeared order, sequence, punctuality, logic, lending to the course of these gigantic interests, the seeming of a machine with multitudes of wheels moved by a force elemental, invincible. For even those who had known him longest and most intimately, Darvid had become this time a surprise. He had surpassed himself. The number of men was continually increasing who began to look on him as on a rare phenomenon of nature. Whence did the man get such uncommon mental and physical vigor? From midday till hours which were far beyond midnight, he was unceasingly active. When has he time to sleep and take rest? What is he seeking to reach? What will he reach? This last question brought out before the imagination of men certain summits of financial might, to be reared to such dizzy heights for the first time in the history of the country. A giant of mentality and energy. Some said he is superhuman. But in the immense number of men connected with Darvid by a net of most varied relations, there were some to whom he seemed a curious enigma, representing a certain inveterate struggle, the motives of which rested on the mysterious basis of his being. That hurling of himself with greater force than at any time hitherto into the whirl of occupations and business, that exertion to the remotest limits of the possible, directed toward one object of thought and energy, seemed to penetrating eyes, not merely a thirst for acquisition and profit, but a desperate conflict with something undiscovered and invisible. At that moment of his life it seemed to some that Darvid was like a man running straight forward and with all his might, because he felt that were he to halt, something awful would seize him. Others said that he called to mind a man into whose ear some buzzing insect had crept, and who was hiding in a factory filled with uproar which was to drown the unendurable buzzing of the insect. The truth was that Darvid was building at that time, and with iron labor, a wall between himself and the giantess whom, for the first time in life, he had seen face to face, and very closely. It was clear enough that he had always known, not merely of her existence, but of this, that there was no power in the world more familiar than that giantess. Still, this knowledge of his had been in a comatose condition, something separated altogether from the everyday substance of life, and touching which there had never been any need of thinking. Someone dies, a certain acquaintance, a comrade in amusement, a famous or unknown power in the world. What do people say? A pity that he is gone, or no help for it. Well, what influence can the disappearance of that man exercise on a given sphere of human action, on the course of men's relations and interests? Life, like a rushing river, tears all living men forward, and behind them, ever more distant, remains that misty region, which is filled with the vanished and forgotten. Who are they who, at any time, think of that misty region, and look at the face of the giantess who reigns in it? Priests, perhaps, devotees it may be, a few poets at times, or people who sail on a slow and sad stream in life. Darvid had never had time for such thoughts. The stream which bore him on was rushing and roaring, glittering and turbulent. But the giantess, because of her power, sprang over all golden mountains, and came. He was thinking of this at the moment when Krenitsky saw him standing at the wall and squeezing into its snowy drapery, just as a frightened insect might squeeze itself into a cranny. That was a cranny in one more of his golden mountains. In the great city, people had spoken with amazement of the cost, well-nigh fabulous, of that last chamber of the millionaire's little daughter. He had means to do that and much more. What are those means to him? He had vanquished enormously great things in life, and he had immense power at that moment. But of what use is that power to him, since something has come which he cannot overthrow, something against which he can do nothing, and which has struck him doubly, struck his heart with pain and his head with anxiety? What virtue is there in power which cannot shield a man from suffering? And even suffering is not important, since man can battle with it, but to shield against annihilation. That, at which he was looking then so nearly, was a sudden and merciless annihilation of life, blooming in all its charm and with great fullness. Something out of the air, something out of space, and from beyond boundaries attainable by human thought, had rushed in and trampled down that life fresh and beautiful. A power invincible, not to be bribed by wealth, persuaded by reason, or vanquished by energy. A mysterious power, the beginning and object of which were unknown, which had flown in on silent wings and swept from the earth everything that it wished to take, and against this there were no means of resistance or rescue. It seemed to him that the gloomy rustle of giant wings was filling that snowy chamber of the dead from edge to edge, and for the first time in life he felt things beyond mankind and the senses. His breast, which had breathed with pride, his head, which held one faith, the might of reason, and that which reason can accomplish, were struck now by an incomprehensible secret, which roused in him for the first time a feeling of his own inconceivable insignificance. He felt as small as an earthworm must feel when on the grass along which it is crawling, the shadow of a vulture falls as it sweeps through the azure sky, and as the worm hides in the crack of a stone, so he sank into the snowy folds of crepe and muslin which veiled the walls of that chamber. He felt as weak as if he were not a man of strong will and splendid labor, but a little child which is unable to push aside with its tiny fingers the terror which is standing out in front of it. With his shoulders and one half of his head sunk in the snowy folds, with his glance fixed on the sleeping face of Kara, which was visible among the white flowers, he said to her mentally, "I can do nothing, nothing for thee, little one. I can do much, almost anything, but for thee I can do nothing." Slender, grayish bits of smoke passed above her sleeping face, and, impelled by invisible movements of air, stretched in waving threads from her to him. Just at that moment he saw Kranitsky come from an inner apartment of the house and kneel at the steps strewn with flowers. He looked, he recognized the man, and felt none of those emotions which his name alone had roused in him previously. What were human anger, hatred, disagreement in presence of that immense something into whose face he was gazing at that moment? What could Kranitsky, hitherto hateful to Darvid, be to him now, when he said to himself, "I know not, I understand not, it is impossible to comprehend this, and still it is real, since I can do nothing for thee, my little daughter." But this was not the only discovery which he was to make on that occasion. He knew not how many hours he had passed in that chamber, but he saw the dawn, which drew a blue lining beyond the snowy folds which covered the windows, and then he saw the sun which flooded it with molten gold. He heard clocks striking a number of times in a chamber. One of these clocks was base, and announced the hours slowly somewhere behind him, while another before him answered in a thinner and more hurried voice, till, all at once, beyond the closed doors in one of the drawing-rooms, music was heard. Darvid knew what the meaning of that was, another golden mountain which he had reared for the little one. Much gold had been poured out in bringing those voices, the chorus of which raised a hymn of prayer and sorrow above his dead daughter. But previously the door was opened, and the white chamber was half filled with the highest of the most brilliant society in that city, showing signs of profound respect and sympathy. Prince Zeno escorted Malvina Darvid, who was all in tears and black crepe. Marian brought in the princess. Irene entered, leaning on the arm of a young prince, celebrated for beauty. Next came stars of these three powers, birth, money, and reputation. They were not many, since summits are always few in number. Slight sounds were heard of bringing, giving, and moving chairs. There were whispers and the rustle of silk garments. Black silks, laces, and crepe, the black dress of men mixed with glittering white, hands folded sadly on knees, or crossed on breasts with seriousness, faces sunk in thought, solemn stillness. Meanwhile, out of silence in the adjoining chamber, to the accompaniment of instrumental music, rose a grand funeral hymn, given by a chorus of the most famous artists in the city. The solemnity of the mourning, with its character of high life and unusualness, roused admiration for the man who had given such magnificent homage to his departed daughter. From out the mountain of gold gushed a fountain of enchanting music, on which that child sailed away beyond the boundaries of earthly existence. Darvid did not greet those who entered, and for the first time in life, perhaps, failed to meet the demands of society. They also, respecting a frame of mind which they divined in him, troubled the man in no way. He remained resting against the wall, and from a distance resembled a silhouette outlined on it darkly, as on a background. He looked on the brilliant assembly, from which he was separated by half the chamber, and felt that he was divided from those people by a space as great as if they were at one end of the world, and he at the other end. Those shadows there whose names he knew, but who were nothing to him, and he nothing to them. They might exist or not. That was all one to Darvid. Why had they come? Why were they there? Never mind, he knew only this, that they did not exist for him, as he did not for them. He was struck by the feeling of an immense vacuum which divided him from men. This vacuum was something like a space which the eye could not take in, a space with two edges, on one of which he was found, and they on the other. They were by themselves, he was by himself. The singing of the chorus rose in power, in thunders, then became like nightingale voices heard in space, with notes clear and resonant. Invisible movements of air passed along the crepes, and the immense number of tapers, causing the flames on them to quiver. Darvid had not paid attention to music. He had never had time to learn and to love it, but he felt that those tones were passing into his vitals, moving the secret strata of his being, and bringing them into movements unknown to him till that moment. He looked at Kara's face, rising up among the white blossoms, and he thought, or rather felt that, while those others seemed removed by boundless space, she alone was very near to him. Mine, he whispered, she alone. He did not know precisely how that could happen, but mentally he placed that little head with golden hair upon his shoulders, and said to it, "Let us flee, little one. Thou didst ask me once what those people were to me. Now I will tell thee that they are nothing. I do not need them. They are strangers to me. With me they have no relations whatever. Thou alone art needful to me. Thou alone, such a sunray as I once saw on a journey and forgot, bright and warm. Thou alone art mine. Let us go. Let us flee together from all and from everyone, for everything and all people are nothing to you and me. They are strange and distant." Here he remembered that never and nowhere would he be able to go with her or to flee with her. He was joint possessor of a number of railroads. He had the power to employ for himself alone a number of trains passing over those roads. In the east, on a gigantic river, his own vessels were sailing in clouds of steam, in one capital and another, and in this great city swarms of people inhabited his houses. Still he could not take that sleeping girl by land or by water to any city or to any house. To his eyes, which were raised toward her, a biting moisture began to come, and gathered into drops, a number of which flowed down his cheeks and were shaken in every direction by quiverings of the skin. But at that moment appeared on his lips the smile, which, as people said, was bristling with pinpoints. What is this? Is it exaltation? He discovered exaltation in himself. A few days before, nay, down to that very night, he would have laughed at the supposition that in him it could darken judgment and clear vision. He thought, however, that a man is at times to himself the most marvelous of all surprises. Under various influences, forces spring up in him, the presence of which he is farthest from suspecting. Darvid discovered, now in himself, the thing most unexpected, exaltation. The habit of a lifetime, that which he had always considered as an unshaken conviction, rose now with loud laughter at itself. Will he begin now as a poet to write a threnody over his dead daughter, or like a monk yield himself to thoughts about death, misery? Earlier, that word had occurred more than once to him, but only now does it career through his head freely. Still, he will not let exaltation master him. He must stand erect and look at things soberly. He straightened himself, removed his shoulders from the wall, calmed his face and glance, by strength of will brought a greeting smile to his lips, and moved toward his guests. The moment the hymn stopped, he gave his hand to those present in very polite welcome, and thanked them with a few but pleasant phrases. This was the beginning of one of those Herculean struggles, the like of which he had fought many times in the past. This, in its farther course, had an orgy of labor, which he continued for a number of weeks, and which roused admiration or curiosity in every onlooker. One day, Between his return from the city and the hour of reception, he was standing in the blue drawing-room at the window, thinking what that peculiar movement was which on returning from the city he noted while walking up the stairway. Porters were bearing out articles of some sort, which he did not examine, but which seemed to him pictures, and other things also. Was Marian leaving the house? Perhaps. It was impossible to foresee what that self-sufficient and stubborn youth was capable of doing. But whatever happened, he would not yield, and he would permit no longer that vain method of life with its mad excesses which are costly. But in those recent hours everything, not excepting Marian, had concerned him considerably less than before. Why was this? He did not answer that question, for he heard a noise of steps and a whisper, "Aloysius!" He looked around. It was Malvina greatly changed. Beneath her hair, dressed with stern simplicity, her forehead was furrowed with a dark, deep wrinkle. The corners of her pale mouth were drooping. On the back of her head a heavy roll of hair, coiled carelessly, dropped to her dress of black material, which was almost like the robe of a religious. She stood in the descending darkness, some steps from him. She had pronounced his name, but was unable to go further. Her white hand, resting on a small table, trembled. Her head was inclined, and she raised to him eyes which were dim, but had a painfully timid and anxious expression. They looked at each other for a moment, and then he inquired, "In what can I serve?" The question was polite and formal. After a moment of hesitation, or of collecting her strength, she began, "Irene and I are to leave here in a few days. It is impossible for me to do this without speaking to thee, Aloysius. I have waited for a convenient moment, and seeing thee here, I have come." She was silent again. She breathed quickly, and was excited. Standing toward her in profile, the definite and sharp outline of his face was fixed on the background of the window, beyond which was darkness. He inquired, "What is the question?" She answered in a whisper, "Be patient, this is hard for me." And as if fearing to exhaust that patience for which she was begging, the woman began hurriedly, and therefore without order, to say, "A common misfortune has struck us. Thou hast been, Aloysius, so kind, so immensely loving to our poor Kara. When I go from here thou wilt be so much alone. Marian has some project of travel, so perhaps, if it were possible, if thou couldst forget the past, I do not know even, forgive. If thou shouldst wish, I and Irene would remain." While speaking she gained some courage. Some internal motive was to be felt in her, which forced her to speak. "I will not try to justify myself before thee, Aloysius, nor to deny that I am guilty. I will say only this, that I, too, was unhappy, and that my fault has caused me dreadful suffering. I wish to say to thee, Aloysius, that perhaps, even on thy part also, for thou didst not know me, that is, thou didst know my face, my eyes, my hair, the sound of my voice, and they pleased thee, hence thou didst make me thy wife, but thou didst not know my soul, and didst not wish to be its confidant or its defender. This soul was not devoid of good desires, not without some small beginning of heartfelt happiness, though it was the unfortunate soul of a woman attacked by wealth and idleness. But thou, Aloysius, didst make a rich woman of a girl who, though poor and a toiler, held her head high. Thou didst make her a rich and unoccupied woman, who was left to herself at all times. Still it was thy wish and demand that I should represent thy name in society with the utmost effect, thy name, thy firm, as thou didst call it." She was silent, for her eyes met his smile, which was bristling with pinpoints. "It seems to me," said he, "that in this tragic piece which it pleases thee to play, the role of villain will fall to me." "Oh no," cried she, clasping her hands. "Oh no. I did not wish to complain of thee in any way, or to make reproaches. I have not the right, but I think that since all of us in this world are guilty in some way, and life is so sad, and all is so poor, it would perhaps be better to forgive each other, to yield, to renounce. This is what I think, and though my pride is wounded this long time because all that I must use is thine, I yield, and I will use it, though my only wish is to go from here, to withdraw from the world, to vanish forever in some lonely corner." Her voice quivered, shaken by sobbing, but she restrained herself and finished, "I will renounce this desire, and remain, if only thou wish, if only thou wilt not despise me." With his profile outlined more and more sharply on the window-pane, which grew darker from the gloom, he answered after a moment of silence, "I will renounce this desire, and remain, if only thou wish, if only thou wilt not despise me." I have not the strength for it. I am very sorry, but in me is not stuff to make the hero of a Christian romance. Thou hast perfect freedom of movement. Kranishna belongs to thy daughter. Thou mayst vanish with her in that lonely corner, in which I cannot wish pleasant lives to you, or remain and live here as hitherto, which I could understand better, but in no case. He stopped suddenly and was silent. While speaking with that woman, he had felt beneath his throat a coil of snakes stifling him, but in his brain certain memories were sounding, as it were voices, the echo of something distant. This echo issued from that woman's features, changed and faded, though the same in which on a time he had fixed his eyes with rapture, from the sound of her voice, which, at all times, had possessed for him a charm beyond description. His head, as if pressed by something above him and invisible, dropped with an almost indiscernible movement. Shall he forgive, and what would the result be? An idyll, harmony, a return to family happiness? Folly, that can never be. Only one thing in this world is undoubted and indestructible, a fact. A fact has taken place, and there is no power in existence to cause that fact not to be. All views except this are exaltation. After a moment of silence, he finished coldly and with deliberation. In no case can my feelings or our relations be subject to change. She rested her hand against the table more firmly, and bent her head lower. Through that head were still wandering certain thoughts of a return to pure womanly honor through expiation, through yielding obediently to the will of the offended. Then she began in a very low voice, "Can I aid thee in any way?" After a moment of silence, he answered, "No." "Can I be of use to thee in anything?" He was silent a little longer and said, "No," a second time. The profile which had been turned to her was looking now through the window pane to a ruddy cloud, which was moving on in darkness above the roof opposite. That cloud reminded him of something. She looked at him, and after a moment added, "Our daughter will write to thee, Aloysius." He interrupted her hurriedly. "Thy daughter!" She began in astonishment. "Irene." He knew now that that ruddy cloud moving over the darkening sky reminded him of Kara. He turned his face toward the face of the woman standing there. "Irene is thy daughter," said he. "For what meaning have blood bonds when there are no others? I had a child who was my own." At that moment desire for revenge boiled up in him, the desire to crush, so he finished. "And I lost her, through thee." "Through me?" Her questioning cry was full of amazement. "Thou knowest of nothing, then? They have hidden it from thee, a proper regard for the delicate nerves of a woman, but my rude nerves of a man feel the need of sharing this knowledge with thy nerves." Slowly and emphatically he uttered his words, words which, from moment to moment, were hissed through his pallid lips, and thus he concluded. "Once thy daughter had an interesting conversation with me, a very interesting conversation about everything which took place in our family idyll." The little girl, hidden behind some furniture, heard the conversation and became mentally disordered. Oh, temporarily, of course, and this would have passed, but under its influence she exposed herself to the cold night air so as to die. Inflammation of the lungs was complicated by mental disorder. Her death was suicide. The last words went out of his straightened throat in a suppressed whisper. Still they were so definite as to be heard in every part of the great chamber. They were deadened, however, by the overpowering shriek of the woman and the noise made as her body fell to the floor. Pani Darvid's knees bent under her, and dropping, with her face in her hands, her head struck the corner of the table near which she had been standing. At that moment Irene shot into the chamber. Like a skylark flying forward to defend its little ones, she ran to her mother, and surrounding her bent form with both arms, she raised to her father a face covered with a flood of tears. "A needless cruelty, father," cried she. "Ah, how I hid this from her! How I tried to hide it! This is a needless cruelty. I thought that a man as wise as thou would do nothing so uncalled for. But thou hast committed a vileness." Darvid made an abrupt movement, but restrained himself, and with his face toward the window he heard the retreating footsteps of the two women. There was a second of time during which he turned his head, and his lips moved as if some word, a name, was to escape from him. At that moment the two women, holding to each other, moved slowly through the next drawing-room, advanced in the increasing darkness, and vanished. He uttered no word. What was his feeling when she shrieked and struck her head against the edge of the table? Was it pity? Perhaps. Was it a quiver of sorrow for that past which had left him forever, and for that daughter who went out with the word vileness hanging on her lips? Perhaps. But he said nothing. He uttered no name. He remained alone. It was silent around him and empty. Emptiness occupied that part of space beyond the window, for the rosy cloud which had passed there a while before had vanished. The figure of Darvid standing at the window became darker in that gloom, which, growing denser, dimmed and then concealed the white, the blue, and the gilding of the great drawing-room. By degrees the lines of his face became invisible. His trembling hands and the quiver of the skin on his cheeks were no longer to be distinguished, and Darvid appeared on the gray background of the window as a narrow and perfectly black line. He did not go away, for he was riveted there, fixed in thought, filled with amazement. In this way, in this manner, then, all things on earth are ended. Those invisible giants, death, insanity, anguish, rage, go about the world trampling, crushing, rending, and no man has power to arrest them. He had never thought about those giants. How could he? Was he a philosopher? He had not had time to think. Now he was thinking, and at the bottom of his stony meditation he beholds a pale, dreadful visage, something which recalls a Medusa head, which he had seen some time in a picture. It has struggled out of raging waves and is resting on them face upward. Its hair is torn, its gaze has endless depth, and on its blue lips is a jeering smile. What is it jeering at? Perhaps at the grandeur of the man who appears as a narrow line on the gray background of that window, black and alone as he is, in the gathering gloom and the silence. Now something soft and timid touches his feet, and he sees a little dark point moving. He stoops and calls, "Puffy!" At the floor was heard thin barking. Puffy had always barked that way to call the attention of his mistress. Darvid bent low with his hand on the silky coat and repeated, "Puffy!" Then he straightened himself, and, leaving the window, called several times in succession, "Puffy! Puffy!" The black line moved on, in the gray darkness, through 2 drawing-rooms, and behind it, on the floor, rolled the dark, small ball-like object, till a space of bright light gleamed before them. This was the widely open door of his clearly lighted study. In the door, the footman pronounced loudly a name, at the sound of which Darvid's step quickened. At last the man had returned. The envoy, the agent, the hound had come hack. Beyond doubt he brings favoring news, otherwise he would have no cause to come. Hence that colossal business, that immense arena of toil and struggle through which an enormous vein of gold runs, may belong to Darvid. How timely this is! The business will freshen him, snatch him out of the evil dreams into which he has fallen for some time past. Indeed, all these exaltations, all these elements of feeling which have risen in him with such power, are an unwholesome and nervous dream, out of which he must shake himself and return to clear, sober, sound reality. Remember to subscribe.